Good afternoon, everyone. And I'd just like to start by issuing thanks on behalf of all of us to Sia for all their hard work and support for these projects, and in particular for organising this afternoon's activity, which I think is a really great chance to hear about all the exciting research that's going on. And I'm just very conscious that we've got two speakers on kind of textiles and clothing, but coming at this in a very different way to kind of Kai's very fascinating research. Okay, so the 18th century Molly house represented a relatively safe space for men who engaged in same-sex sexual activity to meet for companionship, entertainment, sexual relations, and love. However, contemporary accounts of these spaces are largely hostile. Reports of raids conducted by religious groups, criminal trials, mocking exposés, and essentially hack journalism. But one element of behaviour of the Mollies that all commentators reported on was the tendency of the men in the houses to cross-dress as women, and as you can see depicted on the slide here. As the 18th century developed, the Molly became synonymous with effeminacy and symbolised the then criminal body of the gay man. Although the Molly house as a gay space has received some academic attention, the figure of the Molly is much less understood. Whereas women who cross-dressed in men in this period have been the focus of many scholarly works and exhibitions, including at Chawton House, men who dressed as women, particularly before the late 19th and 20th centuries, is a subject that remains unexplored. So this project brings together myself as a historian of gender, sexuality and crime with Professor Maria Hayward, who's a historian of dress. And our CIA funding made it possible for us to undertake a feasibility study for a much larger project on men in cross-dressing, which we're now applying to the AHRC to fund. Our project had three key aims, and I've identified these on the slide. First, to identify what items of female clothing Mollies were depicted as wearing, and how these related to contemporary fashions for both men and women in the period. We want to understand the circumstances under which men might have worn women's clothing, and what they wore, including accessories such as wigs, hats and capes. Second, to research where this clothing was acquired, whether it would have been borrowed, adapted or specially made, and who the suppliers of this clothing would have been. And third, to examine how men wore female clothing, employing the embodied turn in dress history to discover what adjustments were made to items through the reconstruction of a Molly wardrobe. Our CIA grant has facilitated us, particularly in addressing the first and the third of these aims, and I want to go on now to briefly demonstrate this. So objective one is about the visits we've made, and I do feel as though I'm kind of showing you my holiday snaps here, but I promise there was lots of work going on. But what there is here is a record of just some of the visits we've made as part of our grant to examine 18th century clothing, portraiture and the clothing trade. Since our CIA funding ended, we've been successful in being awarded follow-on funding from the History Small Awards to extend our visits on into 2023. We've been to extant clothing collections such as the Bath Fashion Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as locally at Southampton Museum's collection to examine in detail the design and construction of 18th century garments for both men and women. The timeliness of our research is demonstrated by an upsurge of exhibitions about 18th century fashion and male clothing, and we've been able to attend Dandy Style in Manchester, Fashioning Masculinities at the V&A, Crown de Couture at Kensington Palace, and Georgian Style at Buckingham Palace, all of which has helped us think about the garments themselves and also the gendering of clothing. In addition, we've scoured a range of archives, both visual and written, including the Hines Archive at the National Portrait Gallery, the Bodleian Library, the London Metropolitan Archive, the British Museum, and Chawton House Library, to uncover accounts of cross-dressing men and reactions to them, as well as discussions regarding fashion across the period under consideration. One key conclusion arising from these activities has been the confirmation of the feasibility of this project by utilising a diverse and unusual range of sources. We're now in the position of constructing a complex methodology that draws upon a vast array of types of primary material in order to answer our questions. And we'd be particularly grateful to hear from any colleagues who have experience of working with a similarly diverse range of sources. Objective 2. Dr. Amy Clark, who is actually a product of the MA in 18th century studies here and then went on to complete her PhD on female celebrity culture under my supervision, was employed through our CEA grant to research and construct for us a database of images of clothing and cross-dressing in the late 17th and first half of the 18th centuries. She did this through mostly online resources, but also trips to the British Library. We purchased a website and a domain name to use to collate all the information that she's found, but currently this isn't intended as a public resource. It will be used by the project team as it evolves. We're in discussions with James Baker about the effective maintenance and archiving of such materials, and that conversation will continue. This slide provides a bit further detail on how we're able to navigate the website material. It's organised chronologically by decade, with each page containing images relating to that decade. Within each decade, the images have been divided into 4 strands, which you can see identified on the slide. We want to be able to situate the clothing that cross-dressing men might have been wearing within this wider spectrum of fashion for that particular decade. So I've located typical visual examples of both male and female clothing, of any contemporary trend setting or celebrity figures that may have influenced fashion choice, and any existing depictions, usually satirical, of cross-dressing men. The rationale for including particular images in the database is also provided by short explanatory notes. This process has been hugely illuminating for us and Amy, in that, as in this example I provided on the slide here, it's not always immediately obvious whether the figure portrayed in the image is male or female. And in fact, we have to look at visual clues such as the context of the image, the body shape, facial appearance, in order to read this very carefully. Amy's done a wonderful job in constructing a resource for us, which we will continue to expand and develop as the project grows, and is a vital reference point for our work. Our third objective was to begin the reconstruction of types of clothing that a man visiting a Molly house may have worn. This involved employing the skills of an expert seamstress, in our middle slide here, Dr. Nikki Miles, who's attached to the School of Historical Dress and completed her PhD at Southampton. She was able to adapt extant patterns for early 18th century stays and petticoats to accommodate the male form. As well as employing Nikki, our CEA grant paid for the purchase of cheap calico material to be able to make a mock-up of a full outfit, as well as the necessary accessories that we could not produce ourselves, such as a smock, shoes and bum rolls. We also have purchased a better quality damask fabric to construct a final version of this draft outfit that you can see on the slide here. Our very patient volunteer Molly, that you can see here, underwent a series of fittings, and the process was captured by a professional photographer, and we've been recording conversations with Nikki and our model throughout, with their reflections on the process. We've addressed things like the weight of the clothing, the comfort, etc. Anyone who was roaming the upper second floor of Avenue campus in the summer of 2022 may have had a slight shock if they discovered our temporary dressing room and studio. Our SEER grant was invaluable in allowing us to test the feasibility of our plans for a project on cross-dressing men. And we're delighted that it offered proof of concept, and we're very excited for the directions we plan to take our research in. We're currently preparing an application to the AHRC Standard Research Grant Scheme that builds directly upon this project. We intend to broaden our chronology to move into the later 18th and early 19th centuries to address questions of change across time and fashion and sociability. We are shaping our research questions beyond just the figure of the Mollie to include other examples of men who cross-dressed, from the masquerade and the theatre to crime and protest, to situate the Mollie in a broader context beyond same-sex culture. And our research to date has enabled us to identify a geographical focus for our project, which will keep London at its centre, but will also undertake case studies of cultures of cross-dressing in the provincial towns of Brighton and Southampton. We've faced significant challenges so far in our project. We'd originally established a project partner who very unwillingly had to withdraw this summer due to a major restructuring of the museum service in Manchester, which meant all staff were told they're no longer allowed to take on external projects. We're very conscious that similar constraints are impacting many heritage services and organisations nationally, and we would be really interested to hear from colleagues about how this has also impacted their plans and how they've overcome them. As it happens, our need to be agile in response to this disappointment has offered us an exciting new opportunity to locate our study on the south coast with a focus on Brighton and Southampton, as I mentioned. There's a considerable intellectual rationale for this, which I don't have time to expand on now. But in addition, it overcomes a very practical geographical hurdle. We no longer have to travel to Manchester all the time, and allows us to utilise connections with Brighton University and museums, and the wonderful local links and resources here in Southampton, which I'm going to talk about in another few minutes. So this is very much a case of watch this space. Our SEER grant has been instrumental in forming the basis for a much larger project. We're also realistic that the likelihood of securing a large grant can be quite low. So we're thinking creatively about ways to still undertake much of the project work using smaller pots of money and perhaps scaling back some of our ambitions if need be. Ultimately, as well as proof of concept, we're convinced of the importance and timeliness of a study that situates the motives of cross-dressing men in a wider history of clothing, gender and sexuality in the 18th century.